the triangular trade. In 1441, Portuguese explorers made it to the African coast to capture slaves. They needed a source of labor, after all, after their failed attempts. They rose successful, and they have finally brought slaves back with them to Europe. This was the first time slavery started, and it would soon continue. Yet, they've completely found out that you could just go to Africa and get slaves.
Wait, we could just go to Africa and get the slaves from them?
Slave trade was soon starting, and the Portuguese were the first to start it. They brought guns to the local Africans in order for them to capture slaves. The Africans thought, hey, this might be a great idea. Maybe they'll treat slaves the way that we do. Africans completely treat slaves like they're part of the family. The Portuguese just slowly nodded and said, yes. Slaves were then brought overseas to the Americas, being forced into doing, well, slavery. That's not really a hard question. Seriously, how could you not get that? It doesn't matter. Alright, the slaves would then work really hard, and then they would make raw materials, something that the Americas have always been known for. Upon making these raw materials, they would then be shipped back to Europe, where they would be made into guns. And so on, 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 and so on! Well, yeah, if you get the idea, they would continue doing this, and this caused the triangular trade. The triangular trade was basically what I have just said. It is a giant triangle that... No, that's not the right... No. Closer, The triangular trade was something very simple. The Portuguese would bring guns to Africa to get slaves. Slaves would be brought to America for them to make raw material. Raw material would be brought back to Europe, and that would be used to make more guns, and this cycle would continue for at least 400 years. The most well-known of these passages was the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the crossing from the slaves being brought to the Europeans in Africa all the way to the Americas. To most Europeans, it would seem to be looking like something like this. And then this is what the slaves thought at first. But once they got on, this is how they thought. It was so bad, many would try to starve to death. Others would be cast over if they were sick.
Yeah! Here I come!
Even after all of that, only about 3/4 of all the slaves that were boarded on boats actually made it to the Americas. And even after that, they got right off the boat, and they had to work 14 to 16 hours immediately. A lot more of them died. After that, the slaves would still die from awful things, such as heat stroke and disease.
Cough, cough.
The slave trade would continue till about the 1800s, in which there was a large abolitionist movement. Abolitionists were people who were against slavery, and they tried to protest against it, and they also were successful. In 1803, slave trades were ended first by Denmark, causing the importing of slaves to Denmark to be illegal. Other countries followed in its footsteps, especially Great Britain, who went to extreme forces by policing the Atlantic to make sure that the slave ships would not bring any illegal slaves over. And then, finally, in 1833, there was an abolition in Britain, which completely freed all the slaves that were available in England. And among that, other countries would follow, with Brazil being last, who free all its slaves in 1888. The slave trade brought many depressing thoughts of how the slaves would have to suffer on boats for long extended periods of time, and still almost try to kill themselves just to get out of being a slave. However, with them, they also brought food, language, and among other things that helped spread African culture. They also even made their own form of Christianity, and they also helped spread some of their architectural ideas. However, with the slave trade being as depressing as it is, these things are often overlooked. But the slave trade was still a very depressing thing, and there were many causes to it, along with many consequences from that. It's all over now, and we do not have to worry about this depressing moment in history.